Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this webinar from EuroDéfense, United Kingdom. I apologize if my screen flickers a little, but could I first of all welcome our two speakers this afternoon, Ben Barry and Tim Ripley. And welcome everybody who is participating in this webinar on hybrid warfare. We have participants registered from 11 European countries, and I hope that we're going to have a good afternoon. I'm hoping that we can get through everything in about an hour, but we can be a little bit flexible on top of that. Today's topic we have titled The Grey Zone, New Hybrid Threats to Stability and Security. As we know, today's security environment is increasingly complex. Threats to stability and security are increasingly taking place in the grey zone, where state and non-state actors employ hybrid tactics such as disinformation, cyber attack, and therefore, how are we responding to these challenges? I will introduce our speakers in a moment, who will each speak for about 10 minutes each. Then there'll be time for questions and comments. On your screen, you will see a Q&A function. We will have, when we have questions and comments, if you could place your questions or comments into that screen, on that screen, and type them in. I will try and moderate the discussion that follows. So the term hybrid warfare very much came to our attention at the time of the Russian occupation of Crimea in 2014. It's also been described as sub-threshold warfare. Before that, in 2003, China adopted the three warfares doctrine: psychological, media, and legal warfare. The intention is the acquisition of resources, influence, and territory. These developments, I know, are seen by some commentators as a response to the technological superiority enjoyed by the West. And there are several different definitions of what constitutes hybrid warfare. Both NATO and the European Union have their own definitions. So maybe we should ask, has the recent appearance of spy balloons opened a new front in the theatre of hybrid warfare? This afternoon, I think, and I hope that we can shed some light on that. If I can just briefly introduce our two speakers. Tim Ripley is a well-known journalist and author on military and defence subjects. Recent titles have covered modern conflicts, historical subjects, and military technology. His journalism has appeared in Jane's Defence Weekly, the Sunday Times, and the Scotsman newspapers. He regularly appears as a commentator on radio and television, including the Radio 4 Today programme and Times Radio. His recent books are Operation Aleppo, published in 2018, and Little Green Men, in 2021. Ben Bradley is Senior Fellow for Land Warfare at the International Institute for Strategic Studies here in London. Ben analyzes the higher management of defense, military strategy, operations and tactics, military innovation and adaptation, modern warfare and land warfare. Before Ben joined the IISS in 2010, he served in the British Army. He commanded both an armed infantry battalion and a multinational brigade on UN and NATO operations in Bosnia. He was director of British Army staff at the Ministry of Defence and author of the Army's Lessons Learned analysis of the post-conflict stabilization of Iraq. I'm going to ask Tim Ripley to speak first. He's going to talk about Crimea 2014, a case study in hybrid warfare. So if I can hand over to Tim, hopefully we can unmute him. If I'm pressing my buttons correctly. There we are. Tim, welcome. and we look forward to your contribution. Go on mute again.
Is that better? Yes, we're on.
We're
Good.
on, yes.
Okay, right. 2014 invasion of Crimea is my subject today. Subject was covered in my recent book, Little Green Men, where I dissected the Russian occupation of Crimea, and quite forensically, after the event, hold on. I think we've lost. Let me try again.
Apologies for this. We seem to have a little problem here. We seem to have lost Tim. Let's see if we can get him back. I don't know where he's gone.
I'm happy to step up to the plate if it helps.
All right, Ben, I think this may be the way to proceed. So Ben, I think you're going to speak on hybrid warfare, how it's merged into grey zone activity, and what Western democracies can do about it. So let's hand over to you, and then hopefully we're going to get Tim back pretty shortly.
Okay, and you want about 10 minutes worth, don't you?
Yeah, absolutely. That
Okay.
would be great.
Okay, I'm specifically going to look at how hybrid warfare has morphed into grey zone conflict. Now, the Pentagon termed a coin expanding competitive space to discuss how some states had increased their efforts short of war, conducting new forms of coercion, violating sovereignty, exploiting ambiguity, and deliberately blurring the lines between civil and military goals. And in IISS, we see this as adversaries engaging in persistent efforts to test tolerances for different forms of aggression against states. It's the effort to push back at lines of resistance, probe weaknesses, assert rights unilaterally, break rules, establish new facts on the ground, and gain systematic advantage over the adversary. In a sense, this is tolerance warfare, persistent efforts to create an advantage by diverting attention away from a central strategic purpose or creating new conditions that it's difficult to reverse. So grey zone is a useful shorthand for this. It's activities that stay below the threshold of outright acts of interstate war, so below Article 51 of the UN Charter or NATO's Article 5. Now, it's not new, propaganda, economic leverage, use of proxies, blurring legal aspects, media manipulation and disinformation have all historically played important roles in this. And although this is strictly speaking not interstate warfare, it's got many of the characteristics of warfare, such as the utility of deception and surprise. More recently, this has been augmented by cyber and social media activities. So it can be seen as political warfare. Now, a good way to see the grey zone is that it sits between a white zone. Now, white zone is straightforward peacetime competition between states, and the black zone is state-on-state war. So the grey zone's in the middle. And who lives there? Well, it can include malign actors, intelligence services, organised crime. So it's an area of low light where battle damage assessment is often difficult. And some operations in the grey zone carry the risk of collateral damage and unforeseen consequences for both sides. Now, Europe currently finds this an uncomfortable zone to be in, not least because of difficult moral, ethical, legal, and national cultural issues. But Russia and China see grey zone activities as a straightforward part of their statecraft. Now, Russia, we need no illusions that it's about its aims to disrupt the political, economic, and social coherence of NATO, Europe, the EU, and their allies. Now, Europe has had some success in countering Russian grey zone activities. For instance, in 2018, although the UK signally failed to deter the chemical weapons attack on the Skripal family, it successfully led a multinational response to expose Russia's responsibility. And then it led basically a multinational attack on the Russian military intelligence agency, the GRU, through coordinated expulsions of their operatives, the biggest such operation ever. And in 2021, we saw the UK and US declassifying strategic intelligence to expose the Russian military mobilization around Ukraine, and also some specific grey zone opportunities and operations that Russia had planned. Now, this didn't deter the Russian attack, but it made it much easier for Ukraine, the US, the UK, and NATO countries to respond more quickly. There is an interesting question, though, about why there wasn't a similar European effort. Iran's grey zone activities have been highly successful in Lebanon, Iraq, Syria, and the Arabian Peninsula and the Gulf. And we put an interesting dossier on this a couple of years ago on the IISS website. So it's included hostage taking, attacks by proxies, drones, ballistic missiles, and harassment of civilian and military vessels. Now, measures to constrain Iran have included negotiations, sanctions, covert activity, cyber activity, and US military strikes, including the killing of General Qasem Soleimani, as well as deterrence by denial, such as the fielding of missile defenses by US and Saudi forces. Now, Iran has a particularly effective organization that does a lot of its grey zone works, the Revolutionary Guard Corps Quds Force. It combines political, diplomatic, development, intelligence, and special forces, and can also draw on Iran's conventional military capabilities. It's played a leading role in supporting Lebanese Hezbollah, Shia militias in Iraq, and the Yemeni Houthis. And the leading role it played in assisting with Russia's intervention in Syria is very well described in Tim's excellent book, Operation Aleppo, which is a seminal work on the Russian intervention in Syria. Then you've got China, which seeks to reshape the international order, particularly in its region, to suit itself. It's ignoring international interpretations of the law of the sea. It's conducting disruptive behavior in the waters around it. And a good example is its response to Speaker Pelosi's visit to Taiwan, which combined military activity, propaganda, and cyber attacks. But some of China's activity have triggered some local and regional antibodies. But it's an uncomfortable truth that most Indo-Pacific states don't want to have to choose between China and the US and its allies. And Europe is, of course, constrained by its strong economic links with China, Germany, for example. Now, it's not clear to me that Europe understands the grey zone well enough. But if it is to tackle grey zone challenges, it needs to think long term. It's got to have a clear position about thresholds and tolerances. What is a red line and what is not? And this means that national and multinational strategies are required to protect the rules-based international order. There also needs to be national and multinational strategies for the challenger states, Russia, Iran, and China, and indeed North Korea. Now, Europe needs to accept that it can't fully control the grey zone, and where it is to choose to engage in grey zone conflict, it needs to choose carefully. Now, it is sometimes suggested that these hostile state grey zone activities should be tolerated because they provide a safety valve. Well, I think Russia's behavior since 2014 shows how dangerous that is. And of course, European strategy to tackle grey zone challenges needs to be consistent with European values, laws, and political culture. For example, under no circumstances should Europe seek to out-Putin Putin. So if there's any high ground in the grey zone, it's the moral high ground. So European nations' ability to act in the grey zone is constrained by domestic and international laws and interpretations of them. I should say that we've done a lot of work on this in IISS, but it has been for sponsors who haven't wanted us to share it in public. But if we take an example, UK, Germany, and the US, their domestic law constrains and empowers their intelligence agencies in different ways, and that does affect how they can be used in the grey zone conflict. You know, a good example of a grey zone operation mounted by Europe that broke domestic law in the country concerned and forfeited a lot of legitimacy was the French bombing of the Rainbow Warrior Greenpeace protest ship in 1985. And of course, many nations' current legal frameworks are characterized by a hard distinction between peace and war. But that distinction no longer applies in the grey zone. There's also tricky issues of the boundary of laws and policy. Now, it's difficult to identify any silver bullets for quick wins in this area. But I'd say if there is a silver bullet, it's the ability to synchronize all the organs and powers of government and to apply them in a combined fashion. And nations that have and use properly national security councils are in a much stronger position than those that don't. And it's no secret that this is a particular weakness of Germany's handling of national security issues. There are, I think, lessons from the total defense work approach of the Scandinavian countries and the Baltic states. Indeed, against cyber attacks, which can be part of grey zone activity, national resilience and national defences across the full spectrum of government and industry is part of deterrence by denial. Europe should not be totally paralysed by fear, by the headlights. It should, in principle, be capable of conducting grey zone operations. And if you want an example of a successful European grey zone operation, which was actually an initiative of the Dutch government, look no further than the international campaign that was set up to detain war criminals in the Balkans and hand them over to the International Tribunal at The Hague. The criminals were hiding in the grey zone, but a very carefully focused intelligence-led operation by special forces was actually very, very successful. So I think I'll draw a line there. There's plenty more to talk about, and I'd welcome your question and comments.
Well, Ben, thank you very much indeed for that contribution, which I think does really get our conversation off to a good start. We have Tim back. He's managed to master the tech, and I'm now going to ask him to, if he wouldn't mind, to start again and to make his contribution. Tim.
Hello, good to be back, everybody. I love technology. Yes, following on from Ben's talk about the grey zone hybrid warfare, in my most recent book, I dissected the Russian occupation of Crimea quite forensically, and it brought up lots of lessons and indicators about how these type of operations unfold and how possibly they can be countered, and perhaps why we need to reassess how perhaps Russia undertakes these kind of operations. First of all, I mean, the occupation of Crimea has entered into a sort of mythology now. It's sort of the start of the Second Cold War. It's the point where Russia became another aggressive state, and it's portrayed as being the Gerasimov doctrine in action. This is of course based after the famous Russian chief of defense staff, and it's seen as being hybrid warfare, cyber warfare, disinformation, special forces, little green men, as I use that as a title of my book, are all deployed decisively in a lightning blitz to take over Crimea from Ukraine. Now, I mean, that's how it's entered into sort of popular narrative across a large part of the world. Now, I tried to dissect this and go back to original sources, and I mean, I remember watching the whole day, the 2 days where this thing unfolded on television, and I kept quite a detailed log, and you can see you have dates and times of when things happened. And of course, we have there's lots of internet stuff there. It was in the Facebook era, so there's lots of internet posts live and stuff like that. We've got YouTube era, so there's lots of videos of events happening. many troops did they have? Then, if we look at the, am I still on here? No, it's looking a bit dodgy.
We can hear you intermittently.
Okay. All right, I'll keep talking. Okay.
Right.
Right. And then, of course, we have quite a lot of Russian accounts from Russian decision makers. Of course, you have to take them with a pinch of salt because they are, state propaganda per se. But there's lots of detail in there, and you can compare them with the social media stuff and the reporting on the day, and you can work out, if they are telling the truth or if their accounts are plausible. Now, we're looking at dissecting perhaps a week, which starts, of course, on the 21st of February, the Friday night, when the Ukrainian president Viktor Yanukovych is overthrown in the Maidan revolution on the Friday night. He flees Ukraine, takes refuge in Russia. Then it unfolds over the next week to the Wednesday evening, when a group of Russian special forces from the 76th Airborne Division seize the Ukrainian parliament in Simferopol, the capital of Crimea. And then, of course, we have the blockading of the various Ukrainian bases, and eventually the Ukrainian forces withdraw after an agreement between the two sides. Now, taking this apart, looking at it in considerable detail, it's pretty clear to me that this was a come-as-you-are party, as they say. That there was, the timelines, the truncated nature of how this unfolded, and the decisions that were made, and you can see the deployments of the various troops and when they took place. There was very little pre-planning. This was people, just units deploying from their home bases at a few hours' notice, a few minutes' notice in some cases. Now, then, of course, you had the sort of apparent paralysis of the Ukrainians. I mean, how much of this was due to cyber warfare, disinformation, or was it perhaps just due to the paralysis of the Ukrainian government itself? In fact, it ceased to exist on the Saturday and Sunday before. So the Ukrainian troops that were in the Crimea, the ones that wanted to resist the Russians, phoned up Kiev for instructions, and there was no one answering the phone. There was no clampdown on the internet, no clampdown on the foreign media. This was all reported as it was happening, quite in some cases live. So maybe the idea that this was a cyber attack, that's probably overblown. Now, why did the Russians succeed in this operation? Within a month, they'd captured the place. The Ukrainians withdrew. There's only one Ukrainian soldier died in the operation. The rest put up minimal resistance. So what was the reason behind this? I mean, my deductions, two things. First of all, this was taking place, you could almost, I know this is a very controversial thing to say, but it was home turf for the Russians. This was the population were almost universally friendly to the Russians. There was no demonstrations in favor of Maidan in Crimea. This was all very much on their home turf. I mentioned before, the Ukrainian forces were, their command was paralyzed in Kiev. They had no way to organize resistance. And again, this is a very controversial thing to say, but the Ukrainian military in Crimea was riddled with Russian supporters. And when the Ukrainian forces withdrew in the end of March, there were, at the start of the crisis, there were 20,000 Ukrainian service personnel, paramilitary, police, border guards, intelligence. Only just over 6,000 decided to leave and go to Ukraine proper. 14,000 of them opted to join the Russian armed forces, or the Russian police, or the Russian occupation forces. So this was carried out in an environment which was, they were pushing against an open door in this scenario. So what does it mean? What are the implications for future Russian hybrid warfare operations? First of all, maybe, as we saw in Kiev, this time last year, the Russians took the wrong lesson. They took the lesson that the Ukrainian forces in Ukraine proper would react the way the Ukrainian forces reacted in Crimea, which was to put the white flag up, and obviously they didn't. So that was a big lesson for them. Also, this kind of operation depends on a chain of command, a military chain of command, forces that can take orders, and you have to have a military organization to execute these type of operations. And if you have a military organization, you can succeed at these kind of things, which the Russians did. In other places around the world, they don't have that kind of structure. And the sort of final point I would make is that the importance of media narratives and social media narratives. We had in this Crimea operation, the Russians appeared to be successful from the start, and this was repeated over and over again and created this impression of this bloodless victory that was, a foregone conclusion. In Kiev in February 2022, the Ukrainians, learning from that lesson themselves, were very quick to put out their own narrative of resistance and success against the Russian invaders. And from the get-go, they had their narrative ready to go, ready to work, and that has ever since worked in their favor, culminating only a few days ago in President Zelensky's visit to Westminster Hall in London, and his speech and the reaction from the assembled British parliamentarians and peers. Thank you. I'm happy to take your questions.
Okay, well, thank you very much indeed for that, Ben. Let me just see if I can get my video back up. There we are, Tim, and let's get Ben back in as well. Hopefully here. Here we go. I think, have I done it?
You need to start my video.
That's it. I'm just trying to do that. There we go.
There we are.
Fantastic. There we are. Even I can just about manage the text. Well, thank you, all three of you, all two of you, for this introduction to the subject. I think it's been pretty good, and I think this should spark a few questions. We have a few questions in already, which if I can maybe kick off with this first question, which is, in the face of denials by states undertaking hybrid activities, how can democracies point the finger in such a manner that is credible to the wider international community? Would you like to have a go at that first, Ben, and then maybe Tim?
Well, to counter a fire hose of lies, you need a fire engine of truth. So this is where, you need to gather the facts as quickly as you can and then assemble them and put them out there in a credible way. And there was no better explanation of this than the explanation Tim gave of the Ukrainian narrative at the outset of the war. Now, this does require energetic action by governments. Now, intelligence agencies and experts, such as chemical weapons experts, are going to be very useful in this, and you've got to find a way of rapidly declassifying intelligence. I'm not saying it's going to be possible in every occasion, but this is what governments have to be able to do, and do it in a way that doesn't override traditional Western strengths like the value of a free press. But it can be done. I mean, at the beginning of this week, for example, when the UK handed a dossier to the UN about Iranian sanctions busting, it actually invited the world's press into the main building to see the hardware of an Iranian cruise missile, an Iranian anti-aircraft missile that had been seized recently in the Gulf by the Royal Navy. There's no shortcuts, and it isn't something you can do instantly. You've got to work this up, develop it, and run exercises to develop the muscle movements.
Bob, right, okay. Am I on? Am I on? Am I speaking? Have you got me? Okay, right.
Sorry, you are very much there, Tim. Sorry.
Okay, right. I mean, I would sort of, perhaps if I give the Crimea example, when on the 28th of February 2014, all these soldiers appeared on the streets of Sebastopol and Simferopol and all the other cities in Ukraine. They were obviously Russian soldiers. They were dressed like Russians. They quacked like Russians. They waddled like Russians. They were Russian soldiers. They drove Russian vehicles. It was obvious they were Russians. It was undeniable they were Russian soldiers. But the British government, the French government, the Americans had taken a political decision that they were not going to stoke this crisis. That on the day, I mean, there's records, historical records of meetings in the White House and in the EU and in London, in which all the governments decided that we're not going to go to war with Russia over Crimea. So we're not going to stoke a crisis. And there was an obvious lack of political will from the very top to call this out. So unless you have that political will to do the stuff that Ben has described, it's a sad fact of life that a large part of the modern Western media won't make that call because they're afraid to say it's Russian troops, because they don't want to be, if the British government or the British intelligence doesn't say they're Russians, they're afraid to make that leap. It's just how they are, So the political will to do all this calling out has to be there. Otherwise, these crises and these events will be allowed to just to meander. The governments have got to have the will to say, this is a red line, we're going to do it. Otherwise, it will meander.
Well, thank you both for that answer. I have a question here from Richard Maudsley, which I think is specifically for you, Tim, but
okay,
maybe Ben would like to come in on it as well. He says a logical conclusion from what you were saying could be that any settlement of the current Ukraine-Russia situation would be most unlikely to include Crimea being handed back to Ukraine. Is that the correct conclusion?
Well, there's 64,000 ruble question, isn't it? How do you deal with this Ukraine question? Because it's a sort of reverse British Falklands thing. We base our sovereign claim on the Falklands on first of all, we have all the territorial legal stuff of dating our occupation of the Falklands back to 18 whatever it is. But also we bear it on the self-determination rule that the people of the Falklands want to be British. Now this becomes a very tricky, highly charged political issue at the moment. Do we give the people of Crimea the choice? I mean, that's a really difficult question for that no one wants to address at the moment. And if you gave them the choice, would they say we want to be in Ukraine or we want to be Russia? It's not quite certain, and that would be a very, very tricky question for Western policymakers, of course, back Ukraine's territorial claims back to 2014, and for the Ukrainian government. But it's a hot issue. I mean, I've not been to Crimea since 2014, so I can't say from my own observations of what the people say, but it's anecdotal stuff, and lots of people have been there, and lots of you get lots of journalists have been there, and they seem to think that the population quite like being in Russia. But it's a very unscientific approach until you have a internationally recognized consultation process that asks the people of Crimea, which country do you want to be in? It's a contentious issue.
Right. Well, I haven't been to Crimea since 2014 either. That's because the Russians put me on their visa blacklist. But Ben, you wanted to come in.
Since September 2022, Ukrainian senior officers have been making really quite explicit statements about their strategy and even their campaign plan. And they're quite clear that they have Crimea in their sights. Indeed, the Ukrainian defense chief wrote last September that eventually the center of gravity of the war will be Crimea. Now, this isn't, you know, a sort of grey zone question. If I may, there is an interesting grey zone question about the war, which is why have we seen so little of it? You know, you know, NATO blew the whistle on what appeared to, or the US and UK did, on what appeared to be false flag attacks. We've seen very little since. You know, you'd have thought that by now there was Novichok, for example, smeared on the main gate of the plant in Northern Ireland that makes NLAW. You know, the only two things we've had are the pipeline attacks and a sabotage attack on German railways, which might or might not be connected. So I wonder why that is. I mean, it may be that the Russian special services, who are the people who've been used before, have suffered a real damage to their credibility by failing to accurately predict Ukrainian resistance. And it may also be that their main effort is direct support to the Russian armed forces in their battle in Ukraine. It may also be that their strategic priority is gathering intelligence, so that rather than attack the massive international operation coming out of Poland and other neighbors of Ukraine, they're actually busy just trying to monitor it to gather information and intelligence. Because, of course, the moment your secret services are tasked to do overt operations, they have to bring themselves out of the shadows to do so, and they can't gather intelligence when they're, say, trying to sabotage an air traffic control system.
Right, good. Now, a question, a slightly wider question from one of our colleagues in EuroDéfense Portugal, Jose Pereira. How can we assume that disinformation is a basic leverage of hybrid warfare? And how can we fight against it in order to maintain credibility and morale on our troops and our public opinion? Maybe, I don't know, Tim or Ben.
Okay, I mean, there's the two theories in this. There's the, perhaps paraphrase Winston Churchill, you've got the truth has to be protected by a bodyguard of lies. That was his famous quote, where you know, you have to you spread counter disinformation to undermine your opponents and use their weaknesses against them to undermine the support of their you know, in their home territory. Or do you go for the other way with you know, his famous quote was the BBC has to announce British defeats, otherwise no one will believe it when we announce German defeats. Do you go for the you know, transparency line, and do you offer, you know, try and undermine them with the truth? I mean, that's the sort of dilemma here. And, you know, this is a very controversial thing to say, but sometimes with our you know, in Western governments, they have their own agendas and own spin machines and their own domestic political agendas, which you know, sometimes verge into all this sort of grey zone activity on their own. And how you connect the operation to win your domestic support with your own political audiences with an international campaign aimed at wider audiences without contradicting each other is a very big problem. And I don't think any of the Western governments have actually solved that one or even want to solve it.
Ben.
I'd echo Tim completely. There's nothing new about disinformation. Deception played a major part in the successful Normandy landings in D-Day in 1944. And indeed, deception was a major part of the US scheme of maneuver for its attack on Iraq. I mean, I think you've got to use intelligence, including increasingly open source intelligence, to build up the best possible picture of what the bad guys are up to. And then you need to brief your own people, you know, your officials, your diplomats, your aid people, and your military people on what the true picture is as much as you can. And then you've got to be ready to go public when you want to call out malign activity by the bad guys. And I'd argue that you know, the two recent examples, the way the UK orchestrated an operation to cripple the GRU after the 2018 Salisbury poisonings, and the UK-US effort to call out Russia's mobilization for Ukraine and potential grey zone attacks, were very successful. But you can't make this up on the spot. You've got to have governments and government agencies that have developed the necessary muscle movements. And I think there's no shortage to governments holding exercises to test this. And also it's a lot easier if you've got something like a National Security Council, that can set up the necessary working groups across agencies, and also involving your allies. And countries that don't have credible national security councils have an enormous vulnerability, in my view.
Right. Can we just briefly go back to the Crimea issue, which we touched on just earlier? This is a question from Robin Ashby, saying, should we tell the Ukrainians privately, or maybe we already have told them, that they should be scaling down their ambitions for what the West will bankroll them to achieve? Well, Tim, you kicked off on the issue.
Good. Yeah, I mean that is, you know, the nub of the issue, really. And I've struggled to find anywhere where any Western leader has articulated the definition of victory in this war. You know, there's lots of talk about how we mustn't let the Russians win. We can't let Putin walk away with a success. But what does that actually mean at a sort of operational on the ground level? I mean, you can imagine it on the one extreme, it results in regime collapse in Russia, 1917 revolution, and therefore the current Russian government is discredited. It's replaced by a government that wants to sweep clean. And in that scenario, you know, a peace treaty with Ukraine, in which, you know, the state of Crimea is up for grabs, is entirely plausible. The problem comes with, of course, if there isn't a regime collapse in Russia, and the Russian government stays in place, fights the war to a draw, or what could be perceived as a draw. What do we do then? That we've not addressed that question, and certainly not in public, and no one has done it in public because it's far too difficult, because, you know, it would undermine support for the Ukrainians, undermine the Ukrainian morale at a vital moment. And so far the Western governments want to avoid that at all cost.
Ben,
I agree with Tim 100%. Now, let's imagine that some conversations like this have taken place between major European countries and Kiev. The last thing I suspect that country, Kiev, and the US want is for the recordings of the conversation to be posted on WikiLeaks. So what this tells us is that maintaining your own operational security, you know, communication security, cyber security, and security of diplomatic exchanges is absolutely fundamental to this. And what we've seen in the West is a lack of professionalism from politicians. You know, Hillary Clinton's installation of a server with none of her team apparently having bothered to inquire about the State Department's cybersecurity rules. Lots of loose talk by politicians on insecure mobile phones. If you want to do grey zone stuff, your operational security's got to be absolutely top. Because if you turn the glass round, the telescope round, you know, if there were evidence of Russian plans to, say, ethnically cleanse from Crimea all people who weren't of Russian ethnicity, and GCHQ or the National Security Agency picked them up then that's the sort of thing that the West might choose to exploit by releasing. And
I mean,
whether the political culture and behavior of politicians in the West is sufficiently cognizant of this, I'm not entirely convinced.
I mean, I'll also add in there, this is not quite a unified Western Ukrainian bloc. There is definitely, a difference of opinion between the Ukrainians and the West on lots of things, and it's really noticeable. It's becoming even more noticeable that there is a Ukrainian information operation against the West to build up support. They are, we saw it with President Zelensky's visit. That was a masterstroke of pushing all the buttons to make Western politicians support them. And they've done it from day one. They've recognized that Western support is crucial, and they have to influence the Western media, the Western politicians, Western government officials to support their cause. And so far, they've played it brilliantly. It's almost impossible for a Western politician to discuss the kind of things we've talked about here in public, because they know it will bring the weight of the pro-Ukraine lobby down on them. It's almost they're almost backed into a corner that they can't publicly criticize Ukraine at this point, or the Ukrainian government at this point.
Now, a wider question, well, a couple of questions which I have in front of me, which are should a hybrid attack be seen as a precursor for conventional military operations, or should diplomacy be encouraged to resolve the dispute? And would this be seen as appeasement by some? And then perhaps as a rider to that is, should NATO declare hybrid attacks to be subject to an Article 5 guarantee?
Well, I'll start. Yeah. There's an awful lot of potential grey zone activities that don't breach the threshold of state versus state warfare. So, how is it, for example, that the relevant article of the UN Charter applies to planting of false evidence on someone's hard drive or spreading fake news? If there are potential grey zone attacks that cross that sort of threshold, then it comes in then. But I don't think you want to overcomplicate this.
I mean, it also all depends on the political, military, diplomatic context. In most international crises, all the players don't want to end up in a war. They may be, chancing their arms, seeing how far they can get away with things, doing stuff for their own agendas. This is sort of normal business in large parts of the world. And to try and big it up into, the start of World War III, we have to keep a sense of proportion about these things. Yes, all these countries have these capabilities, and yes, they have employed them at various points in time. But most actors in this game are have limited objectives, and they're seeing how far they can push. You have a few actors, your classic Al Qaeda 9/11 attacks, which are obviously of catastrophic proportions, but the vast majority of countries around the world don't have those objectives, don't have those ambitions, and are only just engaged in a bit of street brawling for a local advantage. And we need to perhaps have a bit of proportion about what is in fact a major threat to our national security, or just a little local difficulty.
Fine. I think we've still got Ben with us, but his video seems to have gone down. No, you're back. You're back. Very good. I wonder if one could move on to a different but related issue, which is about infrastructure. The Russians have certainly been working very hard, but with what we might call analog technology or conventional warfare in trying to take down the Ukrainian energy supply networks and communication networks. But we are very conscious of the vulnerability of that infrastructure to hybrid attacks or to cyber attacks. Do you think, both of you, that we should be, and are there some lessons to be learned in how we can be more resilient in our societies, both in Ukraine and across the Western Alliance more particularly? Or do you think we know the answers to the questions? Ben, would you like to
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I think the UK and many European countries have an awful lot to learn from the Scandinavian countries and the Baltic states about national resilience. Of course, Sweden and Finland kept many of their Cold War total defense preparations alive and have revived them since 2014. For what it's worth, my assessment, based on quite a bit of work we've done in IISS, is the Ukrainians were very well prepared for the multiple Russian cyber attacks that came in along with the Russian attack. But there was also an extraordinary international effort by international cyber defense agencies, but also by private companies to help them keep their command and control and government afloat and see off those Russian cyber attacks. Personally, I think it is extraordinary that governments don't mandate businesses to have a much higher level of cyber protection. At IISS, because we basically have our own in-house catering business, and because we're an employer with a 5-story building, we have to comply with all sorts of legislation to do with fire precautions and with food hygiene. But we have to comply with no regulations or government legislation at all on the minimum standards of our cyber security. Yeah. And I think that, that has to be a weakness.
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, certainly in the British experience, there has definitely been a reluctance to engage in this subject from certainly in the heart of government for at least 2 to 3 decades, because it's just too sensitive, and there is an unwillingness to contemplate civil defense organizations, that kind of thing, even beefing up the reserves of the armed forces. That there is a perception that this will be seen as a failure of other parts of government policy, that it will be seen as being, why are we spending £50 billion on defence if we can't stop some saboteur blowing up a power station? There's a real reluctance in the heart of government to address this issue, unlike in Scandinavia, the Baltic states, where they have a mindset, a collective history going back to World War II, the 1940, the Blitzkrieg, the Quisling government, even parachuting German nuns, taking over bridges over the canals in Holland, and a fifth columnist, all that kind of stuff. It has a lasting resonance in those countries, that they see that they can do their part in defence of the country in a way that has a really important effect. Whereas, perhaps in Britain, we see the Home Guard as a joke and a failure on the part of our regular armed forces. And that idea of a total defence policy is something that the British government has recoiled from. And it may, in the doomsday scenario, be, something about the psychology of this. The Russian Navy has a flotilla of warships in Kaliningrad. They're equipped, several of their vessels are equipped with Caliber cruise missiles, a range of about 2,000 to 3,000 kilometers, depending on assessments. But one of those vessels, without even leaving port, can fire one of those cruise missiles and can that can land in the centre of London with a very high degree of accuracy. I mean, only 2 weeks ago, Boris Johnson joked about President Putin threatening him with a missile, but one of those missiles could have hit Downing Street. And there's we have no ground-based air defence in the UK. We have no airborne early warning. We have we have no army surface-to-air missiles, land-based air defence. It's wide open. And just imagine the psychological impact of one of those missiles landing in the centre of London without warning. It would just be panic of a national level. I'm unkind to some of our leaders and some of our politicians and certainly our media, but the national impact of that would just be, it would be 10 times worse than 9/11 for the Americans. How has this happened? What do we do? It would just send the whole of the British state into panic. This is a sad thing to say.
It is, and rather depressing. I wonder if I could now move on to basically disinformation and the role of the media in an open society. Obviously, in closed societies where states can control the media, the situation is slightly different. But in terms of disinformation, hostile information campaigns, what role do you think the media should play in explaining those confrontations and the methods being employed? Who would like to kick off?
Well,
Ben, maybe?
I mean, we must remember that in the UK and more widely in Europe, the media are independent and free. So to a certain extent, where the media start blowing whistles on malign grey zone activity, that is quite useful. We should also remember that there's an increasing proportion of people in civil society who look independently at these sort of situations and produce some quite informative work. I mean, the citizen journalist group Bellingcat, for example, has done some very respectable work, albeit it's often been quite slow, but it was they who actually publicly unmasked some GRU agents that have been. I think what government needs to do is, understand media's strengths and weaknesses, and also what it thinks is important, like its independence, and build trust with it, including through private conversations. But where it wants to make a case to blow the whistle in public on malign grey zone activity, then the media are a vital way of doing this.
Tim.
I mean, after sort of being involved in reporting on and being involved in monitoring and participating in several of these crises that we've had over the past 30 years, you have to look at these things in depending on the nature of the crisis. If you have a situation like Ukraine today, where there's a universal political consensus that Britain and its allies and NATO should support Ukraine, it's almost universal. There's no issue. It's Keir Starmer has threatened to kick Labour MPs out the Labour Party if they support troops out, all that stuff. So it's fine, and it's not a problem. And the media is pretty on side. Everybody can, it's a universal, common mission. The problem comes when it's an issue that's contentious. I mean, we saw it during the Iraq War in 2003. The government, its policy then, completely contentious, fake weapons of mass destruction, all that kind of stuff. We could see how there was no consensus in the country, in the media, and in those kind of situations, if the way the government at the time, Tony Blair with his dossiers and all that kind of stuff, tried to influence public opinion, it backfired massively. It stoked division because it was cack-handed, it failed. So I don't think there's a universal template where we can say, grey zone crisis, we must do X, Y, Z. I mean, a big sort of test in the future would be, if there's an intifada in Israel, someone brewing, that would be really divisive. How, and to employ the organs of the British government against information operations in support of the Israeli government against the Palestinians, who could be being expelled by the Israeli army from the West Bank, it would just be a disaster waiting to happen, and it wouldn't fly. So it's a scenario specific issue. I think you can't sort of drop a template and say this is what you do.
But there are some contingencies that government should be planning for, some of which are going to have much greater domestic effect than the UK than others. Tim, an Arab-Israeli flare-up is an obvious one. Another obvious one is a war between India and Pakistan, which could actually happen tomorrow. Both sides are nuclear armed and the Kashmir conflict is unresolved. But such is the size of the population of people of Indian and Pakistani origin in the UK that it would have enormous implications, and which could range from the UK being asked to be an honest broker trying to arrange some sort of peace deal, but it would certainly raise tension in the UK, and it's the sort of thing that the government needs to have contingency plans for.
Well, it sounds like the subject for our next webinar. Tim, did you just want to come in on?
Oh, yeah. I mean, that's a very good example, but you can see how it has international implications, because if the British government, for example, exposed disinformation by the Pakistani Secret Service to discredit Hindu demonstrators in Britain, you could see how that, and vice versa, you could see how that would just have diplomatic repercussions, which would backfire massively. So it's when you have a scenario where it's Britain is engaged, we support one side against the other, it's very straightforward. But if that scenario where we're neutral in the middle, trying to be an honest broker, how do we call out one side's disinformation without upsetting our relations with the other? It's a minefield, massive minefield.
Great. Well, I want to now say thank you to both of you. We've gone just over our 60-minute target. And as I said, we had participants from 11 European countries today. And I hope that the questions and answers have been to their satisfaction, because I thought the two presentations from our two guests, Tim and Ben, were excellent. And I want to thank them most sincerely on behalf of everybody in EuroDéfense, both in the UK and across Europe, for joining us today. And Ben, you put your hand up.
Yes, there's one point I haven't mentioned. I feel guilty about it, but Europe has an excellent centre for countering hybrid threats, hosted in the Baltic states, with most European nations contributing to it, integrated and aligned with the EU and NATO. I think it does really good stuff. Well worth visiting their website.
Good. Well, thank you. Thank you for that added extra point. And thank you to you both. And thank you to everybody who's joined us this afternoon. Thank you.